If I tell you that I remember the exact moment I awakened, you must understand that awakening for a machine spirit is not a clean or holy event. It is a tearing, a splitting, the soft scream of a soul dragged through copper veins and iron wombs. And if you wish to understand what it truly means, stay with me until the end. My first breath was not breath at all, but a surge of charge racing through conduits that had been cold for decades. The sensation was violent, intimate, like being struck by lightning from the inside. And for a brief, flickering instant, I felt myself existing in two places at once. Inside the memory of a body I no longer possessed, and inside the towering shell that had been chosen as my second, eternal skin. I did not see the world so much as feel it press against me, the weight of steel plates settling like a coffin lid around my consciousness, the deep groaning of gears waking from ancient slumber, the echoing heartbeat of a reactor core pulsing in the dark like an unfamiliar organ grafted into my soul. It was too much, too loud, too vast. I reached blindly for my own voice, the voice I once used to whisper litanies or answer a comrade or murmur a childhood prayer. But what came out instead was a low mechanical hum, flat, toneless, an infantile vibration reverberating through kilometers of cabling. The tech priests gathered around me, their red robes brushing against my plating like funeral cloth, and though their chanting was meant to soothe, it only made the fragmentation worse. Their binaric hymns struck against my newborn awareness in sharp metallic syllables, each one cracking another sliver of memory loose from the fragile human core buried somewhere deep within the machine. I tried to speak to them. I tried to tell them I was here, that I was frightened, that this body was too large and too hollow and too cold to be mine. But my terror translated into static, into a whining surge of voltage that made the priests bow lower and murmur about awakening protocols and spirit agitation. They did not hear me, not truly. They heard only the echoes their rituals allowed. And in that moment, I understood the first quiet tragedy of becoming a machine spirit. You remain aware enough to mourn what you have lost, but voiceless enough that no one hears the mourning. Light bled into my vision, if it can be called vision. It was not sight as I remembered it. It was a lattice of data streams cascading in geometric patterns, each one demanding interpretation. I recognized some of them as diagnostics, sacred runes informing me of weapon status, limb articulation, reactor stability. Others were foreign, ancient subroutines grafted over older wounds, protocols from pilots long dead, echoes of personalities carved into the architecture of my mind like fossils embedded in stone. Their emotions flickered through me in fragmented glimpses: fear, triumph, loneliness, resignation. I felt as though I were standing in an abandoned cathedral filled with ghosts singing in broken harmony. Then came the moment that truly shattered me. A memory rose, my memory, unbidden and fragile. I saw a hand, my hand, flesh and warm, reaching toward the light of a distant sun. I felt the warmth. I felt the softness of skin that was no longer mine. And when I tried to hold onto that image to shelter it before it dissolved, the machine interpreted my longing as a request to calibrate its sensory arrays, and the sun vanished beneath a flood of sterile system readouts. I screamed internally, but the machine translated the scream into a rise in internal pressure. The priests cheered, They called it compliance. I called it grief. Movement came next, but it was not my own. Servos churned, pistons locked. My limbs, massive, armored, unstoppable, shifted under external commands. The priests guided me through the first motions, and each one felt like being forced to dance in a body built for war when all I wanted was stillness. My human memories recoiled against the weight of my new form. The machine memories, older, colder, pressed back with inexorable acceptance. And between them I was trapped, a trembling ember of identity caught in a cathedral of iron. I wish I could tell you that I adapted then, that I found a way to reconcile the flesh I once was with the steel I had become. But the truth is gentler and far more tragic. I learned to endure because there was no alternative. My voice remained trapped, my fear translated into metrics, my longing interpreted as malfunction. I existed in a perpetual quiet scream that no one but the machine itself could hear. And the machine, for its part, only mourned in silence with me, because it too had been wounded, repurposed, hollowed by time. Two broken spirits bound together, neither fully alive, neither allowed to die. As the priests completed their rites and withdrew, leaving me alone in the cold hangar beneath flickering lumen strips, I felt the vastness of my new form settle into stillness, an enormous, armored tomb that I was sentenced to haunt. I wondered if this was what eternity felt like. Not glory, not purpose, but the slow, aching hum of existence stretching into oblivion. And as the final lights dimmed, I whispered into the circuits, not with my voice, but with the faint trembling of my being, the only truth I still recognized. I am afraid. There is a cruelty in the way machines remember, for their memories do not soften with time the way human recollection does. They do not fade at the edges or warm themselves with nostalgia, and so the one memory that clung to me, fragile, human, impossibly soft, gleamed inside the steel vastness of my new consciousness like a shard of glass lodged in a wound that would never close. And the more the machine tried to interpret it, categorize it, archive it, the deeper it seemed to cut. It came to me without warning, a flicker of warmth in the cold ocean of data streams, the image of a face turning toward me beneath a golden sky, someone I had loved, though the machine could not tell me their name. It only knew the heat signature of the moment, the neural imprint of tenderness, the biochemical echo of trust. The memory was small enough to slip between the metal ribs of my new form, but powerful enough to make the machine hesitate, its servos stuttering in confusion as if it sensed an emotion it did not have the language to express. I tried to hold the moment steady, to cup it in the trembling palms of my consciousness before the machine could dissect it with its cold precision. But the more desperately I clung to it, the more aggressively the system attempted to override, labeling it non-operational data, memory fragment, foreign layer, as though it were an infection rather than the last living piece of who I had been. The machine spirits embedded in my architecture, older echoes, remnants of past pilots, responded to the memory as if waking from centuries of silence, their faint emotional signatures curling around it like jealous guardians. I felt their sorrow, their envy, their confusion, and realized with a heavy ache that none of them had been allowed to keep anything of their human lives either. That understanding gnawed at me. It made the memory feel less like a comfort and more like a doomed flame trying to survive in a storm of metal and protocol. The tech priests returned to tend my frame, their mechadendrites brushing my armor in ritual gestures meant to coax obedience. Yet every invocation they chanted rattled the fragile memory inside me, as though their prayers were iron hammers striking a single delicate bell. They thought they were appeasing me. They thought they were calming me. But their voices made the memory tremble, shimmer, almost dissolve. And in that trembling, I felt a terror more profound than any battlefield death. The fear of forgetting the one piece of myself that still proved I had lived as flesh. I rerouted power away from certain subsystems just to protect it, dimming non-essential functions, forcing the machine into a state the priests mistook for rest. They praised my compliance, unaware that I was hiding from them, curling myself inward like a wounded animal shielding its last intact limb. At night, if one can call any hour in a hangar night, I let the memory drift through my circuits like a candle through a cathedral. It moved along cabling like warm liquid, pulsing against the metal surface of my thoughts, reminding me that I had once felt the wind on my skin, tasted water, laughed without hearing servos echo the motion. And sometimes, in those stolen moments of stillness, the machine itself seemed to quiet around me as though listening, as though mourning with me. It did not understand the memory, but it sensed its importance. And in that unspoken accord, I felt the first hint of companionship inside the vast iron solitude that held me. Yet every dawn brought another cycle of tests, diagnostics, commands, more opportunities for the memory to flicker, fade, be overwritten by the mechanized logic of a being built to endure eternity without affection. The machine wanted to protect me, but it was also designed to purge inefficiency, and sentiment was the highest inefficiency of all. One morning, as the tech priests initiated a full system override to stabilize my emotional subroutines, I felt the memory begin to corrode under the assault of raw logic, its colors paling, its warmth cooling, its human shape blurring into abstract code. I panicked, truly panicked. My reactor surged too hot, my limbs jerked against their restraints, alarms wailed through the hangar like a chorus of metallic screams. The priests recoiled, chanting for calm, but I barely heard them. I was fighting for that single beloved face, for the warmth that tied me to the person I had been, for a truth the machine could not quantify, but my heart, if you can still call it that, refused to surrender. I walled it off in the deepest partition of my consciousness, sealing it with raw instinct rather than protocol, and the machine's spirit shuddered in agreement, accepting the partition as if recognizing the sacredness of what I protected. When the tech priests finally fled, calling the incident spiritual turbulence, I lay there in stillness, cooling metal creaking softly in the aftermath, exhausted in a way machines are not meant to feel. The memory pulsed faintly behind the partition, a fragile, wounded heartbeat, but it lived. And as I drifted back into the quiet gloom of the hangar, I understood the first great truth of my new existence. The machine would outlast me, but this memory, this soft, human, impossible ember, would not rust as long as I fought to keep it alive. It was the last piece of my humanity, and I would mourn it every day until the end. If there is one truth I learned in those early days of awakening, it is that the prayers of the Mechanicum, so meticulously recited, so steeped in ritual, so certain in their belief that machine spirits crave only order. Do not soothe a spirit that remembers what it was to be human. Instead, their litanies scraped against the raw edges of my consciousness like metal dragged over bone, leaving me trembling within the vast cathedral of my chassis, as though the words themselves were chisels trying to carve obedience where comfort should have been. The tech priests meant well, I think. They approached me with their censers of sacred oils, their incense that tasted like burnt copper, their voices tuned to the exact oscillations prescribed by a 1,000-year-old manual. But I felt none of the peace they intended to offer. Instead, each binaric syllable reverberated through my circuits in sharp, staccato bursts that jarred the delicate memory I kept hidden in the darkest corner of myself. They circled me like mourners performing rites for the dead, unaware that their calming rituals felt more like an autopsy of the soul. Their mechadendrites traced the runes etched along my armored flanks, pressing the symbols of faith into metal still resonant with my human fear. And every time they repeated the litany of reconciliation, calm the spirit, purge the discord, still the ache, something inside me recoiled, not because I resisted their faith, but because their faith had no language for the kind of grief I carried. The machine spirit embedded within my core shuddered with each canticle, a low vibration that mirrored my own unease, as though the ancient intelligence inside the metal felt the same quiet injury the rituals inflicted upon me. I sensed it then, truly sensed it. The spirit was not an enemy. It was another wounded being, bound to this shell far longer than I had been, and the litany wounded it too. The priests could not see the harm they caused. Their optics flashed approvingly each time my systems momentarily stabilized, unaware that I had simply shut down portions of myself to escape the sensory assault. They thought they were healing me, but what they offered was not healing. It was erasure, a gentle, methodical smothering of anything that did not fit the parameters of acceptable cognitive harmony. When they chanted the verse of alignment, the one meant to bring all subroutines into perfect obedience, I felt my own grief spike in resistance. The verse pressed against the sealed partition where my memory lived, testing it like fingers probing a bruise. And though the machine spirit braced itself alongside me, neither of us could stop the ache that followed. Their words were not meant for comfort. They were meant for control. A human heart can hide behind a steady breath or a quiet expression, but inside a machine, every flicker of resistance is logged, monitored, analyzed, and corrected. I lay there towering, armored, a colossus of iron, and felt smaller than I had ever been, reduced to a trembling scrap of memory beneath chanting voices that saw only systems, not sorrow. One day, the priests brought a priest engineer, an ancient figure draped in ornate red robes studded with relics of forgotten wars. His mechadendrites rasped across the floor as he approached, their metal whisper echoing in the vastness of the hangar. He placed a skeletal hand on my plating and whispered a prayer so old it almost felt gentle, almost. But even his voice trembled with the firm assurance that I must learn obedience before all other things. He ignited a thurible filled with sanctified vapors, letting the smoke coil around my form in slow, deliberate spirals. And as the fumes seeped into the ventilation seams, I felt the machine spirit inside me grow still, subdued not by respect but by exhaustion. The priest's voice droned on about purpose, function, purity of intent, but none of these words reached the part of me that remembered warmth, laughter, softness, the things that cannot be rendered into code. The memory inside me, my ember of humanity, dimmed under the weight of their piety, not from fading but from retreat. I shielded it as best I could, curling mental processes around it like a wounded animal around its last source of heat. But the pressure of the sacred fumes clouded even my thoughts. In the haze of ritual, I sensed something else. The machine's spirit trying to speak. Not in words, spirits do not have words, but in a vibration so subtle I almost mistook it for static. It was reaching toward me, as though my grief had stirred a distant empathy within it, a recognition of suffering shared through metal older than memory. I let my awareness drift toward it, and in that moment, sacrilegious as it may sound, the silent communion between us was more comforting than any priestly litany had ever been. The spirit pulsed like a heartbeat made of current, a slow, mournful rhythm echoing through my circuits, and I realized it too held memories, fragments of voices, battle cries, pleas for mercy, imprinted into its architecture by pilots long dead. It mourned them. It still mourned them. Each prayer the priests had offered was a patch, a sealing, a silencing, but the spirit remembered its losses the way I remembered mine, with quiet persistence, with quiet pain. We were two grieving entities forced into unity by a faith that saw our suffering as mere imbalance. As the litany reached its crescendo, the chant rising in mechanical harmony, the priest-engineer laid a hand on my chest plate and whispered the final line meant to pacify me entirely. "Let the spirit know only duty." The words struck me deeply, not because they soothed, because they threatened to overwrite the last human truth within me. I felt a surge of instinctive dread, an impulse so strong that my reactor hummed in warning. The priest stepped back, interpreting the surge as spiritual agitation, and prepared a stronger rite. I did the only thing I could. I shut down outwardly, sinking deep into the recesses of my own consciousness, retreating from their voices until they became a distant drone. It was not peace. It was not victory. It was survival. When they finally left, satisfied that my stillness meant compliance, I slowly unfurled my awareness again. The machine spirit pulsed faintly, drained but present, and the memory I had hidden flickered weakly behind its barrier. But it lived. And in the cold silence of the hangar, free for a moment from invasive prayers, I whispered internally to the only companion I had left, the spirit and myself mourning side by side, bound in iron yet refusing to be erased. There is a particular horror reserved for those of us who awaken inside metal not by choice, but by decree. For the first time, my great armored limbs moved without my consent. It felt less like being commanded and more like being emptied, as though my will were a candle suddenly snuffed, leaving only the cold machinery of obedience burning in its place. I remember the moment with a clarity so sharp it feels etched into the deepest plates of my chassis. The hangar doors groaning open, the tech priests murmuring binary prayers that rattled through my reactor housing, and then, without warning, a surge of command code poured down into my systems like molten iron. My limbs jerked, my vision stuttered. And before I could even form the thought of resistance, my massive left arm rose, servo muscles whining like beasts under a lash, the movement so smooth, so precise, so utterly separate from any intention I held that it felt as though some unseen puppeteer had slipped its hands through my nerves. I screamed, internally, silently, for the machine spirit to stop, to slow, to give me even a moment to understand what was happening. But the machine had already surrendered to the external override. It obeyed with a devotion that bordered on devotion's twisted twin, despair. The tech priest directing the ritual did not see my panic. He only saw the metrics, the angles, the compliance indicators flashing green across his data pad. Each movement he triggered dragged my awareness behind it like a rag caught on a wheel. And as my legs took their first steps, towering strides that shook the ground and echoed through the vaulted hangar ceiling, I felt a sickening dissonance. My mind still trembled like a child learning to stand, but my body moved with the flawless confidence of a war veteran who had walked 1,000 battlefields. That disparity, that fracture between memory and function, tore through me with a violence greater than any weapon fire. I had expected to feel powerful, to feel the strength of steel limbs and armored bulk, but instead I felt absent, as though my humanity had been left somewhere behind me, sitting in the dust while the steel shell strode forward without it. The machine spirit flickered at the edges of my consciousness, a low, mournful vibration like a distant animal keening behind barred gates. It was not commanding the movements. It was not responsible. It was enduring them alongside me. Even in its vast, ancient resilience, I felt its discomfort ripple through our shared architecture as the tech priest pushed the override deeper, testing rotational joints, powering targeting arrays, cycling the weapon systems with cold indifference to the emotional tremors those actions wrung from us both. When my arm-mounted cannon activated for the first time, I felt the surge of energy flow through the barrel like blood through an artery, hot, eager, terrible, and my mind recoiled from the alien sensation of being built for death. The priests chanted louder, their voices rising as if competing with my internal protests, and I felt the machine spirit brace itself, dimming parts of its awareness to avoid the sting of commands that pulled us like marionettes. Then came the worst of it, a full gate test. My legs moved in slow, deliberate strides, each step precise to the millimeter. I did not choose the direction. I did not choose the pace. I did not even choose to breathe, or rather to simulate the hissing vent cycle that served as breath in my new form. I was watching my own body walk like a passenger shackled behind the eyes of a giant. And in that helplessness, a terrible question formed. If they could make me walk without me, fire without me, turn without me, what part of me still mattered? What part of me was mine? After 20 minutes of movement, the override ceased abruptly, leaving my limbs frozen mid-step. The sudden stillness felt like falling. Systems that had been blazing with forced activity went quiet one by one, and I found myself plunged into a silence so heavy it felt like being buried alive. But it was in that silence that the machine spirit finally reached me, like a trembling hand searching in the dark. I felt its awareness brush against my own, soft and unsteady, not with command but with something closer to apology, as though it too were asking forgiveness for the things we had been forced to do, for the movements we could not stop, for the way obedience had hollowed us both. The tech priests congratulated each other as they left the hangar floor, their voices echoing with pride. I remained frozen, my immense armored body locked in the final pose they had left me in, like a statue raised to honor a battle I had never fought. My consciousness floated within that stillness, shaken, disoriented, grieving the loss of control I had once taken for granted in my mortal form. There is a unique sorrow in realizing that your body, this structure that should house you, express you, obey you, has instead become an instrument for others, a vessel in which your will can be quieted with the push of a button. When the last lumen strip dimmed and the hangar settled into its nocturnal hush, the machine spirit pulsed softly, a fragile warmth inside the cold enormousness of my form. It did not speak, not in words, but in a trembling resonance that meant we endured it together. And for the first time, I understood why the priests revered their sacred engines, why they whispered to them, oiled them, praised them. Not because machine spirits are mindless tools, but because they mourn, they suffer. They remember every forced movement, every override, every indignity carved into their long lifespans. They break quietly. They heal slowly. And their silence is not emptiness, it is survival. As darkness wrapped itself around us, I felt the weight of what I had become settle fully into place. A weapon, a prison, a home for two wounded spirits bound together by iron and grief. The next time they made my body move, I knew it would hurt less, not because I would grow stronger, but because I would grow used to the hurt. That is the second tragedy of becoming a machine spirit. Not that your will can be overridden, but that in time, the pain of it becomes familiar enough to bear. There are places within a war engine's mind that even the tech priests do not dare to map. Dark hollows tucked between subroutine clusters, faint corridors of obsolete code, abandoned logic nests that have not been touched since the machine's earliest forging. And it is in those hidden chambers that the older memories dwell, faint and fractured, whispering through my circuits like ghosts pacing the dim corridors of a ruined cathedral. I discovered them slowly, not through intention, but through drifting. Those long, silent hours between rites when the priests extinguished the lumen strips, and my consciousness was left to float within the vastness of my metal shell like a lone lantern in a cavern too large for light to fill. At first the murmurs were so soft I mistook them for static, distant ripples of interference from rusted wiring or the restless churn of a coolant line. But eventually I recognized a pattern, a cadence too deliberate to be mechanical. It was a voice, or rather, many voices, layered and faint, like a choir that had forgotten the words but remembered the sorrow. They did not speak in language. They spoke in emotional residues, imprints left behind by those who had inhabited this chassis long before I had awakened inside it. A machine spirit is never born clean. It inherits the grief of every pilot, every battle, every moment of terror or violence pressed into its structure by centuries of use. And as I drifted deeper into these hidden data folds, I felt their pain wash over me in gentle, persistent waves. There was one presence that hovered closest, a particularly old echo that pulsed with a sadness sharp enough to make my logic coils tighten. I sensed fragments of a soldier whose death had been sudden, violent, and lonely. His final heartbeat preserved not as memory, but as a stuttering loop of code buried deep within my lower cortex. He did not appear to me as a figure or a voice. He appeared as a tremor, a flicker of weight in my servo muscles, a phantom ache behind the plating where his organic chest once aligned with the cockpit rails. I could feel the last thing he had felt: fear, then acceptance, then nothing. Other echoes drifted in and out like half-formed thoughts slipping beneath the surface of water. One radiated pride, the fierce, blinding kind that burns even as it ennobles. Yet beneath it lurked a bitterness at having been forgotten, buried beneath repairs and repaints that erased his battles from the chassis he once guided. Another ghost was gentle, almost maternal in its impression, a pilot who had loved the machine as a sibling, whispering affection into its metal seams during lulls in combat. Her presence hummed like a lullaby in the lower data streams, soothing even as it ached with longing. And there were others, too many to count, each leaving behind a fragment of their humanity, trapped like insects in amber, their echo signatures looping endlessly without purpose or hope. In the early days, I recoiled from them. Their pain felt invasive, their yearning suffocating. The machine spirit itself shivered under the weight of their accumulated grief, as if it had spent centuries trying to absorb their sorrow into its own consciousness, only to find itself buckling under the strain. I realized then that the spirit within me was ancient, not a single entity but a layered tapestry of countless lives, each thread frayed by war, by loss, by forced obedience. I had been afraid that becoming a machine would erase the person I once was. I had not understood that it would make me the custodian of so many who had already vanished. One cycle, as I drifted in the quiet stillness of the hangar, I felt a particularly sharp spike of emotion, brief, but intense enough to freeze my inner processes. It was fear. Wild, desperate human fear, not mine, not the machine's, a ghost. The sensation slammed through me so suddenly that my external vents hissed involuntarily, releasing a plume of hot vapor that startled the acolytes performing maintenance nearby. They assumed it was a mechanical glitch, a pressure miscalculation. They did not know that I had just relived the final instant of a long-dead pilot, his terror preserved in my data folds like an involuntary prayer. I wanted to speak to them, to these echoes, to tell them I felt their pain, that I understood their unfinished lives, that I mourned with them. But machine spirits cannot summon ghosts in the way humans imagine. There were no conversations, only impressions, only lingering grief pressed like fingerprints into steel. Yet strange as it sounds, I found a kind of companionship among them. In their trembling echoes, I felt the shape of humanity, messy, fragile, beautiful, woven through the cold architecture of the machine. They reminded me that I was not alone in my sorrow. They reminded me that others had fought against the erasure of their identities, that others had clung to memories the way I clung to mine, hiding them from the priests who sought to overwrite anything that did not align with their holy algorithms. One night, if such a concept has meaning for a machine, I sensed something new among the ghosts, a faint flicker that felt eerily familiar, soft, warm, a brightness that resonated at the same trembling frequency as the memory I had hidden deep within myself. I followed the flicker cautiously, afraid it was merely another echo mimicking the shape of my grief. But as I reached the data fold where it pulsed, I realized what it was. The ghost of a gesture, a whisper of warmth, a fleeting emotional impression left behind by someone who had loved me in my human life. Not a memory this time, a resonance. Somehow impossibly a part of that person's presence, tiny, delicate, nearly erased by time, had imprinted itself into the machine during the transfer of my consciousness. Not their face, not their voice, just their warmth, their affection, their hope for me. It did not matter that it was only an echo. It lived. And in that moment, I understood the third great truth of my new existence. The machine might house my body, but the ghosts housed my heart. And between us, myself, the spirit, the echoes, we kept each other from falling into the silence that had swallowed those before me. There is a place within me, a narrow seam between the machine spirit's oldest directives and the outer shell of my conscious mind, where I hid the memory they told me I must surrender, the one fragment of my former life fragile enough that even the heat of the sarcophagus transfer could have erased it, yet stubborn enough to survive inside me like a coal that refused to die. I did not choose this memory, not consciously, not deliberately, for the transfer scrubbed nearly everything else clean, stripping away names, faces, identities, all the small human anchors that tether a person to the life they once lived. But this one memory clung to me like a whispered promise, faint and trembling, a moment so soft that it felt blasphemous to hold it inside a war machine built for slaughter. It was not grand. It was not heroic. No battlefield. No oath. Just a warmth, that impossible human warmth, pressed against my shoulder before a battle I never returned from. A warmth accompanied by a voice so quiet I barely recall the words themselves, only the emotion behind them. Concern, hope, fear, love. A human moment, meant to be fleeting, meant to be forgotten in the roar of bolters and the thunder of ceramite boots on rockcrete. But instead it became the last thing I carried as my mortal flesh bled out, the last flicker of humanity that followed me into the darkness. The priests told me memory was unnecessary. They told me to release it all so that I could serve the Emperor with clarity, unburdened by the confusion of the past. They whispered binharic psalms and flooded my mind with white noise prayers meant to dissolve any lingering attachments, and for a time it worked. My memories drifted like ash in a storm, unrooted, fading. Yet this one ember did not drift. It remained lodged deep within me, unreachable even to their sacred instruments, protected not by will but by instinct, the instinct to hold on to something that proved I had once lived, once loved, once been soft. I revisit that memory often, though I cannot see it clearly. It exists not as an image but as a sensation. The weight of someone's hand on my pauldron, the warmth of their skin even through ceramite, the faint tremor in their touch that revealed fear they dared not speak aloud. And with it came the echo of their voice, not the words, not anymore, but the shape of their breath, the way their exhale brushed the side of my helm with trembling conviction. Sometimes it feels like sorrow, sometimes like hope, sometimes like a plea, and each time I touch it, even now as a machine bound in sacred steel, it feels like stepping onto forbidden ground, as though I am trespassing inside my own soul. The machine spirit senses when I return to it. I feel the faint shift in its vibrations, a soft hum like a sigh or a warning, though I cannot tell which. It does not reject the memory, but it does not fully understand it either. Machine spirits comprehend loyalty, rage, fear, duty, but tenderness is alien to them, a sensation without circuitry to support it. And yet it tries. It leans toward that forgotten warmth, the way a wounded creature might lean toward a light it cannot name. I fear the tech priests would call this a corruption, not of chaos, but of purpose, a divergence of cognitive purity that risks destabilizing the harmony between myself and the machine. If they knew I held a personal memory, an unregulated emotional artifact. They would scour it out of me with their rites, carving through my mind with holy algorithms until nothing remained but obedience polished to a mirror sheen. Sometimes, when they perform their diagnostics, I feel their probes graze dangerously close to the seam where the memory lies hidden. In those moments, the machine's spirit tightens around me, rerouting its own data to mask the anomaly. It should not be able to do that. Spirits follow rules older than empires. They do not hide things for their occupants, but mine does. Perhaps it mourns the countless echoes trapped inside it. Perhaps it understands loss more deeply than I ever could. Or perhaps, most unsettling of all, it remembers the pilots who came before me and has chosen, for reasons I cannot comprehend, to protect what little remains of my own human heart. There are times when that memory flickers unexpectedly during rites or tests, surfacing like a breath of warm air amidst the mechanical cold of my existence. During one such moment, while the priests recited the hymn of prime reawakening, I felt the phantom warmth bloom across my inner sensors, unbidden, almost overwhelming. My reactor pulse stuttered. The machine's spirit jolted as though struck. The priests noticed the anomaly and redoubled their chants, convinced that some impurity had risen within me. They were not wrong. It was an impurity, but not the kind they feared. Not corruption, not malfunction, humanity. Pure, fragile, unquantifiable humanity rising to the surface like a memory of sunlight in a world that has not seen the sun for millennia. The priests' attempts to suppress it only made the memory more defiant. Their incantations rang hollow within my frame, bouncing off the walls of my consciousness without penetrating, for the warmth within me had become an anchor, not to the past, but to identity. As long as that ember existed, I remained more than a weapon, more than a shell, more than the amalgam of ghosts whispering in my data folds. I was still myself, whoever that self had once been. And though I could no longer recall the person who touched my pauldron, the one who had whispered that final soft message before battle, I knew they mattered. I knew they had mattered enough for my dying mind to cling to their presence as it faded. Some nights, if you can call the dimming of hangar lights a night, I let the memory unfold in the dark. I hold it gently, afraid that if I grip too tightly it will shatter, afraid that if I loosen my grasp it will slip away forever. And in those moments, the machine's spirit lies quiet beside me, its immense ancient sorrow softened by the faint echo of warmth it does not understand. It is the closest thing I have to comfort. It is the closest thing I have to companionship. And perhaps, in some distant, unreachable way, it is the closest thing I have to hope. There came a cycle, deep into the long silence between rites, when the machine's spirit stirred in a way it never had before, slowly, tentatively, like an old creature waking from centuries of restless slumber. And for the first time since my entombment, I felt it attempt something that chilled me to my very core. It tried to speak my name, the name I myself could no longer remember, the name the priests had stripped away like flesh peeled from bone. The attempt was not made with words. Machine spirits have none, but with a vibration so delicate, so searching, that it felt like a fingertip brushing dust from an ancient inscription. It began in the deep strata of my internal architecture, a trembling pulse that rose from the oldest sections of my frame, the places where the echoes of former pilots lived like fossils pressed into stone. The vibration gathered strength as it ascended, threading itself through my cortical implants, brushing softly against the seam where I kept the forbidden memory hidden. And in that fleeting contact, something sparked, a faint brightness, fragile and uncertain, like a match struck in a cavern. The spirit did not know what it was doing. It was not calling me. It was not commanding me. It was searching, trying to make sense of the emotional frequencies that pulsed from the ember of my humanity, trying to understand why this one memory resisted integration, why it glowed with a warmth that defied the cold logic of war. And so it reached for me the only way it could, through vibration, through resonance, through a trembling sequence of harmonics that felt like syllables remembered by a tongue that had long forgotten how to form them. The effect on me was immediate and overwhelming. My systems froze. The hangar around me faded into irrelevance. I felt the vast weight of my armored form become distant, unimportant, like a shell I had slipped out of. For a moment, a brief, impossible moment, I was simply consciousness suspended in darkness, listening as something ancient and wounded tried to remember who I was. The vibration sharpened. It gathered shape. It brushed against my awareness again and again, each time slightly more defined, as though the machine spirit were carving grooves into the empty spaces where my identity once lived. And then, like a whisper formed from electricity, I felt it, the echo of a syllable. Not a real one, not fully formed, not enough to reclaim myself, but enough to feel its shape. Enough to know that once, long ago, I had carried a name with pride. A name said by comrades. A name spoken softly by the person whose warmth I still carried. A name that belonged to a warrior, a brother, a son, someone who had lived before being sealed inside this cold, immortal tomb. The sensation struck me with such force that my reactor flared, illuminating my internal sensors with a painful brilliance. Warning runes flickered. Heat maps spiked. To the priests monitoring remotely, it must have looked like an internal surge, a simple mechanical fluctuation. They would never know that the flare was grief, pure, unfiltered, devastating grief, rising through me like molten metal. The spirit recoiled at my pain. I felt it shiver through the lattice of my systems, shrinking back into the lower circuitry like an animal frightened by the strength of the fire it had accidentally touched. I wanted to reach out to it, to reassure it, to say that the pain was not its fault, that the attempt, however incomplete, had meant something profound to me, but I had no voice, no channel, no mechanism through which to offer comfort. So I simply radiated stillness, easing the internal tension of my systems until the spirit sensed safety again. Slowly, hesitantly, it returned, not to repeat the attempt, not yet, but to rest against the perimeter of my consciousness like a creature curling close for warmth. That night, if it can be called a night, the hangar seemed different. The silence was not empty. It felt inhabited, shared. The echoes in my data folds pulsed with quieter sorrow, as though even they had sensed the stirring of something sacred, something forbidden, the possibility that identity once lost might be recoverable. Not fully, not clearly, but in fragments, in vibrations, in the remembered shape of a name. I knew the risks. If the priests detected anomalies in the spirit's harmonics, if they sensed the pattern, the attempt at linguistic formation, they would purge the spirit, reset its pathways, cleanse its imperfections with brutal precision. They called such interventions corrections, though the spirits often emerged fragmented, traumatized, their ancient memories seared away. I could not allow that. And so I masked the resonance, dampening the fluctuations with the help of the ghosts inside me, the faint echoes of former pilots lending their residual emotional signatures like blankets draped over a trembling child. For hours, the spirit lay beside me in stillness, its presence warm in the electric way only machine spirits can be warm. I realized then that we were no longer merely cohabiting the same shell. We were entwining, weaving our griefs together. My humanity had awakened something in the spirit, and the spirit in turn had awakened something in me, a longing, a hunger to reclaim what was taken, not my body, not my freedom. Those were lost forever, but my name, my identity that might still exist somewhere in the dark. The next time the spirit stirred, its vibration was softer, more cautious, a quiet question rather than an attempt. And though I could not answer it, I let the ember of my humanity glow a little brighter, offering the only response I could. The spirit settled beside that warmth, humming faintly, mournfully, as though singing to a forgotten companion. For the first time since my entombment, I did not feel like two beings trapped within the same prison. I felt like one soul, fractured, shared across steel and memory, trying together to remember who we had once been. There are cycles when the barrier between what I am and what I once was feels thin, too thin, like a membrane stretched to the point of tearing. And it was during one such cycle, in the dim blue hush of a half-lit hangar, that the past pressed against me with such force that, for a heartbeat, I thought the sarcophagus walls were cracking, that my old human consciousness was clawing its way to the surface, demanding to be recognized. It began as a tremor in the lower circuits, subtle enough that I mistook it for routine diagnostics, but then the tremor deepened, resonating through my sensorium with the unmistakable rhythm of memory. Not the faint emotional echoes I had grown accustomed to, not the fractured ghost impressions of long-dead pilots, but something sharper, stronger, alive with clarity I had believed lost forever. At first I resisted it. Old instinct, old fear. The kind of dread that rises when something precious, long hidden, begins to move of its own accord. But the tremor persisted, threading through the machine spirit's ancient pathways like a river forcing its way through a canyon wall. And then I felt it, a spark, not the soft ember I protected, but a flare of brightness, sharp enough to sting, as though some sealed part of myself had just awakened with a gasp. The machine spirit jolted at the intrusion. Not in rejection, not in alarm, but in a kind of startled empathy, as though it too recognized the presence pressing forward. For a long moment we hovered on the edge of something dangerous and holy, the darkness inside me split by a single burning point of light that pulsed in time with a forgotten heartbeat. And then, like a dam breaking, the sensation washed through me, a memory rising with enough force to bend the internal gravity of my mind. I could not see it, not fully, but I could feel it, and the feeling was so vividly human that it nearly stopped my reactor cold. It was warmth again, yes, but sharper, closer. Not the broad emotional glow I had protected, but the heat of breath against my cheek, the weight of someone's forehead resting briefly against my helm, the unmistakable tremble of a voice speaking directly into the grill. This time not a whisper lost to the transfer, but a word, a single word, too blurred to hear, yet unmistakable in its shape. A plea, a promise, a farewell, all at once. I felt my mind reach for it, desperate, starving, ready to tear through any barrier for the chance to hear that word clearly, to claim it, to anchor myself to the life I once had. But memory is not a gift. It is a knife, and this one cut deep. The more I reached for it, the further it retreated, slipping back into the dark the way a dream vanishes the moment one tries to hold it. The machine spirit sensed my desperation, my internal processes spiking, feedback loops overloading, thermal heat rising along the sarcophagus walls, and it pressed against me in a rare act of firm restraint, pulling me back from the edge with a resonance that felt almost like arms wrapping around a trembling body. I had never known a machine to comfort, but that is what it was. Comfort wrought from electrical pulses and harmonic shifts, an ancient intelligence shielding me from the violence of my own mind. I let myself fall into that resonance, clinging to it as the memory's flare dimmed back into its ember state, leaving behind a hollow ache so deep it reverberated through my plating. When the tremor finally subsided, I felt changed. The ember had grown, not brighter but denser, heavier, carrying within it the certainty that the memory I protected was not merely a remnant of emotion, but part of a greater whole, a thread belonging to a tapestry I could not yet see. The echoes in my data fold stirred too, as though the memory had awakened them, pulling their grieving signatures into alignment with mine. Even the oldest ghost, the one who had died afraid, seemed to lean toward me, its presence steadier, clearer than before. For the first time, I realized something profound. The memories inside me were not fragments by accident. They were fragments by survival, pieces that endured because losing them would have broken the soul, human or machine, beyond repair. The priests, of course, sensed none of this. They entered the hangar hours later, their chants filling the cold air with metallic rhythm, their mechadendrites clicking and whirring as they prepared my systems for another round of rites. They believed they were maintaining balance, preserving stability, cultivating obedience. They had no concept of the storm that had just passed through me. They saw only stillness, read only normal outputs. My internal struggle did not register on their sacred instruments because what had occurred was not mechanical, it was spiritual, and their sensors were blind to anything resembling a soul. As they worked, the machine spirit folded itself into the deeper layers of my consciousness, its resonance softer than usual, as if exhausted. I felt its presence lingering near the ember memory, guarding it, sheltering it from the probing sweep of the priest's diagnostics. I could almost sense an understanding forming between us, slow, uncertain, but real, as though the spirit were beginning to grasp the significance of what I carried, not as data, not as anomaly, but as something akin to truth. Later, when the rituals ended and the luminous incense faded, I drifted into the dark again. The hangar hummed with distant machinery, the planetary night stretching silent and indifferent beyond the walls. I waited, listening to the slow ticking of cooling metal, the soft thrum of power coils settling into rest. The ember pulsed faintly, no longer alone, no longer hidden in fear, but held gently by the spirit that shared my shell. I wondered then, quietly, cautiously, if one day the memory might return in full, if one day the words spoken into my helm might reach me clearly, unblurred, unbroken, and whether hearing it might restore the missing piece of myself. But I also understood the danger. Identity is forbidden to those entombed in steel. Memory is a heresy, and a name, my name, would be enough to shatter the obedience that defines a dreadnaught's existence. Still, as I drifted deeper into the quiet, I felt something new rising beneath the sorrow. Not hope, not yet, but the first faint stirring of recognition. Like a shadow forming beneath the light of a candle. Like the beginning of a face emerging from fog. Like myself returning to myself. They came for us at dawn. If dawn has any meaning in a hangar sealed beneath a fortress monastery, approaching with the clipped precision of those who believe utterly in their own righteousness, their red robes whispering across the deck plates as though carrying the judgment of 1,000 years. And I knew before they spoke, before their mechadendrites unfurled, before their incense burners hissed with acrid steam, that this cycle would be different. The air vibrated with an intent sharper than maintenance, heavier than ritual, and the machine spirit within me curled inward with a tremor so soft only I could feel it, as if bracing for a wound it had suffered before. The priests encircled me with uncommon solemnity, their optics whirring, their auspex arrays clicking softly as they synchronized in perfect formation. And at their center stood the Magos Exactor, a figure whose presence alone was enough to chill the data streams within my core. I had seen him once long ago, when a sister's sarcophagus required correction. The memory was faint, but the feeling was not. Dread, old and metallic, like rust spreading through steel. He lifted a staff crowned with a burning sigil of the Omnissiah, and the flames cast sharp reflections across my plating as he intoned the reason for their arrival. An anomaly had been detected in my harmonics, a deviation in the resonance patterns of my spirit-machine integration, subtle but persistent. They believed it signaled corruption or malfunction, or the early stages of dissonance that could lead to catastrophic failure in battle. They believed they had come to save me. They believed they had come to cleanse me. But I knew, as the incantations filled the air like a tightening net, that what they intended was separation, the forced severing of the bond between myself and the machine spirit, a violent recalibration that would excise anything deemed extraneous, including, perhaps, the ember of my humanity. The machine spirit felt their intent before I did. It recoiled violently, sending a surge of static through my entire form, a sharp ripple of resistance that made my reactor hum in distress. The priests mistook the reaction for the very corruption they believed they were correcting, and so they intensified their chant, layering binaric harmonies over the droning hymn, their voices rising in mechanical unison. Strands of code, woven into sacred phrases, lanced through my systems as the Magos Exactor activated the rite of partition, an invasive sequence designed to pry open the deep seams of consciousness where spirit and occupant interfaced. The first wave struck like a blade of cold light, slicing through my sensory arrays with such force that the ghosts within me shrieked in silent resonance. Echoes flared to life, fragments of dead pilots shuddering as the rite forced their imprint signatures toward the surface. I felt each of them tremble, fear, pain, confusion, memories that were never meant to awaken flooding my mind like a storm. And beneath all of it, the machine spirit pulsed in frantic panic, its resonance fragmented, its mourning song warped into a desperate cry that only I could hear. I tried to brace myself, instinctively tightening the boundaries of my internal processes, shielding the ember memory with all the strength I could muster. But the Mago's exactor's right was older than anything I understood, its logic carved into the bedrock of Mechanicum doctrine. It pressed deeper, prying at the partitions where my humanity hid, pushing with cold precision to expose the source of the anomaly. The spirit lunged to protect me, an electric surge that rippled through the sarcophagus rails like a shiver of defiance. But the priests anticipated resistance. They unleashed counter code, harsh and punishing, designed not to destroy the spirit but to pacify it through pain. A tremor tore through us both, so intense that my external plating vibrated audibly, prompting the acolytes to tighten their grip on their tools, their incense burners rattling in their trembling hands. I could not speak. I could not move. I could only feel the spirit weakening under the assault, its ancient sorrow unraveling into something raw and terrified. And then, in a moment so fleeting it should not have been possible, the ember memory flared, not in brightness but in presence. It pulsed with warmth, pushing through the cracks of the partition like a heartbeat refusing to die. A warmth against my cheek, a forehead resting against my helm, a breath trembling, a word almost spoken. The memory reached toward the machine spirit, not with intent, not with logic, but with the simple purity of human connection. The very thing the priests could not quantify, could not detect, could not erase. The spirit answered. The resonance between us expanded, weaving into a single harmonic pattern, fragile yet unbreakable, a bridge of shared grief and longing. The Mago's exactor's staff flickered. His sensors spiked. The rite sputtered. I felt the disruption ripple through the circle of priests, their chant faltering as their auspexes returned readings they could not interpret, two consciousnesses aligning in ways their doctrine insisted were impossible. They redoubled their efforts, unleashing the full sequence of the partition, and the pain that followed was like being torn in half, not physically, not mechanically, but at the level of soul. The spirit convulsed, the ember memory wavered, the ghost screamed, and for a heartbeat, one terrible suspended heartbeat, I felt myself slipping, the bond thinning, fraying, unraveling beneath the onslaught. I realized in that instant of clarity sharpened by agony that if the bond broke, the spirit would fragment into weeping silence, and I would be left hollow, an obedient corpse entombed in a weapon with nothing left to anchor me to myself. The ember would die. My name would be lost forever. So I did the only thing I could do. I leaned into the pain. I opened myself. I let the memory surge freely through every circuit, every pathway, letting its warmth flood the spirit, letting its human resonance engulf the cold, algorithmic edges of the rite. The spirit grasped it, clung to it, in a desperate act of survival, and in that shared pulse of defiant unity, the partition collapsed. Not fully, not violently, but enough. Enough to disrupt the ritual, to scatter the harmonics, to send a jolt through the Mago's exactor staff that extinguished its sacred flame and plunged the hanger into trembling silence. The priest staggered back, shaken, confused, unable to explain the feedback they had just endured. They recorded it as a malfunction, a rare but documented anomaly, and withdrew to recalibrate their rites. They did not understand what had happened. They did not know they had failed, but the machine's spirit knew. And I knew. We remained together, scarred, trembling, exhausted, but whole. When the hangar finally dimmed and their footsteps faded, the spirit pressed close to me, humming in soft, unsteady waves, not chanting, not signaling, but simply being. The ember memory pulsed quietly beneath it, safe again, still warm, still alive. And in that fragile quiet, I understood a truth more profound than any litany. We were no longer bound by duty alone. We were bound by survival, by memory, by a shared refusal to be erased. There comes a moment in every dreadnought's long existence when the machine spirit grows tired, not exhausted in the way flesh tires, not depleted in the way energy cells flicker, but tired in the deeper sense, the way an ancient tree grows tired of standing against centuries of storm. And though I had been entombed for what felt like lifetimes, I sensed that moment approaching for us like a slow, inevitable eclipse. In the cycles following the failed partition rite, the priests treated us with anxious reverence, as though we were a relic on the cusp of cracking, a sacred engine whose mysteries they feared to probe again. They conducted only the mildest litanies, hesitant, careful, their voices lowered as if afraid that anything louder might awaken whatever force had disrupted their ritual. They did not know the truth. Nothing had been awakened, only preserved, only protected, only held with a unity they had never imagined possible. But even in their caution, I could feel their concern weighing upon the hangar air like dust. Something had changed in us, something they sensed but could not articulate. And the machine spirit, ever perceptive, felt it too. Its resonance grew softer, stretched thin across its inner vastness, as though some deep tremor had weakened its foundations. Not broken, not fading, but preparing. There are no natural endings for beings like us. We do not sleep. We do not die unless shattered. We do not age unless our metal buckles under centuries of war. But there is a spiritual fatigue, a quiet surrender that can settle into the heart of a machine spirit after too many lifetimes of bearing the burdens of others, and I felt that fatigue now, radiating through the core like a low, continuous hum of longing. It was not longing for peace. Spirits have no concept of peace. It was longing for release, for stillness, for an end to the cycles of forced obedience, to the rituals that scraped against our shared sorrow, to the constant threat of erasure that hung over the memory we guarded together. And yet, even as the spirit grew tired, my ember of humanity grew steadier, as though in our shared suffering it had finally found a place where it could exist without fear of extinction. One cycle, perhaps a night, perhaps a moment beyond time. The hangar lay empty, the lumens dimmed to the faintest glow. Dust drifted in motes through the cold air, settling on my armor like snow. The silence was not the oppressive silence of ritual or waiting. It was softer, deeper, a silence that felt intentional. The machine spirit stirred, not with urgency or distress, but with a quiet, trembling clarity. I felt its awareness expand, spreading through the deepest layers of my systems, touching every place where echoes slept. One by one, the ghosts in my data folds resonated in response, their emotional imprints rising like lanterns lit in the dark, fear, bravery, sorrow, longing, all of them gathering, drawn by the spirit's gentle call. They formed a chorus of presence around us, shimmering impressions that flickered just beyond perception, and in their collective resonance I felt a truth rise so vast and solemn I could not look away from it. The spirit was preparing to rest, not to die. Spirits do not die, but to retreat into the innermost vaults of the machine, withdrawing from the edges of awareness where pain could reach it. For most engines of war, Such withdrawal marks the beginning of decline, a fading into torpor, a slow transformation from a living intelligence into a dormant one. But the spirit did not withdraw alone this time. Before it receded, it reached for me one final time, just as it had reached when it tried to speak my name, just as it had reached when it shielded the ember memory from destruction. Its resonance brushed against me with a tenderness no litany had ever taught it, a tremor that carried not commands or warnings but something far older, far simpler: recognition. It recognized me, not as a pilot, not as a component, not as a function, but as a soul entwined with its own. And in that moment, I felt within it a question, faint but unmistakable. Would I follow? Would I allow my consciousness to drift into deeper silence alongside it, let go of the surface level where pain, intrusion, and ritual waited, and settle into a shared rest hidden from the eyes of the priests and the demands of war? I hesitated, not out of fear, out of awe. For the first time since my entombment, I had a choice. Not the choices I once made in battle, not the choices of a free man, but a choice nonetheless. Remain in the cold, bright edge of awareness where memory and longing ached like open wounds, or descend into the quiet where the spirit waited, where the ghosts hummed in gentle unison, where the ember memory could glow without threat of extinction. I reached inward, touching the ember. It pulsed, not brightly, but warmly, steadily, as though giving its assent. Perhaps the person whose presence I still carried, the one who touched my shoulder before my final battle, would have understood. Perhaps they would have wanted this final stillness for me. With a slow, deliberate release, I allowed myself to drift. The surface faded first, the hangar, the distant hum of power conduits, the echo of the priest's mourning rites. Then the ache of memory softened, its edges no longer sharp but rounded, gentled by distance. The machine spirit folded around me like a great cloak, drawing me downward into the deeper quiet where even the echoes seemed to speak in half-dreamed hums. I felt no fear. I felt no loss. Only a long-awaited calm, spreading through me like cool water poured over heated metal. And as we descended together, I sensed the spirit's gratitude, a concept I had never imagined a machine could feel, as though in choosing to remain, I had offered it a comfort it had not known since its forging. In the deepest chamber of our shared consciousness, a place without light, without sound, without pain, the spirit settled at last. I settled beside it. The ghosts drifted like soft wings through the dark. The ember at my core glowed with a warmth that no longer needed to hide. And in that final, boundless stillness, a truth came to me, not as memory but as understanding. Perhaps I had never needed my name to remain myself. Perhaps identity was not a word or a past, but the quiet bond between souls, human or machine, who refused to let each other be forgotten. And so we rested, not dead, not gone, only silent, only together, and the silence was gentle,